It is 6. It's just me and you, but we got 2 on Zoom here, so there's a few of us. Howdy, fellas. Good to see you.
Hey, Ryan.
Hello.
Lecture to an empty room last week. And so there is a video of me doing Galatians last week. I just have not uploaded it to YouTube yet, but I will get that uploaded hopefully very soon. My wife and I just moved to Radford, and I'm in the midst of applying to a PhD program with Michael Bird. So I have a lot of things on my plate right now, but hopefully I can get some of these videos uploaded. So,
that's great. Congratulations.
But we're going to keep on trucking. So tonight is 2nd Thessalonians. There is actually a fair bit to cover here, mostly because 2nd Thessalonians is one of the disputed letters that some people think Paul didn't write. So we will spend a little bit of time talking about pseudonymity and whether or not Paul wrote that letter. And so this will be longer than some of the other books to go through. Because some of them, you get to Philippians and you just talk about Philippians. Or last week, you just talk about Galatians, right? But with this one, we actually have to talk about, the critical issues behind whether or not Paul wrote it. So, well, thanks, speaker. Here, let's try it again. There we go. Okay. So to start out, Thessalonica, you see there on the map, is along the Ignatian Way, or the Via Ignatia. And the image on the right is actually part of the Ignatian Way. Thessalonica is capital of Macedonia. It's named after a queen from, I want to say, like 500 BC or something like that. City's predominantly Greek, but there are lots of other ethnicities there. And so when Paul shows up, there are Jews there for him to interact with. He's probably there somewhere around 50 AD-ish. And he actually probably writes 1 Thessalonians pretty close to the same amount of time, or pretty close to the same time that he's there. It seems like he's there for a few weeks, leaves, and almost immediately writes 1 Thessalonians. And so likely 1 Thessalonians is his first book, the first book written in the New Testament. There's a decent chance of that. Galatians is pretty early. Mark is also pretty early, but probably not earlier than 1 Thessalonians. Ehrman puts Thessalonians as the first writing in the New Testament. And so, if Ehrman is dating something in the 40s or the 50s, there's probably a good chance that it's pretty early. So he is not someone who is inclined to give us an early date like that. So one of the things I'm going to be doing with our actual content lectures when we're actually going through a biblical book is I'm going to go with Bible Project. Here, let me pause this real quick. The Bible Project is fantastic in summarizing the content of biblical books. And so we'll go through these quick little videos each time we go through one of the books of the New Testament. Let me see if I've got volume here and see if this is going to work out. It may be a bust. We'll see. Okay.
Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. This is most likely the earliest letter that we have from Paul, and the backstory for it is found in the book of Acts. It's where Paul and his co-worker Silas went to the ancient Greek city of Thessalonica. And after just 1 month of telling people the good news about Jesus, a large number of Jewish and Greek people gave their allegiance to Jesus, and they formed the first church community there. But trouble was brewing. Paul's announcement of the risen Jesus as the true Lord of the world, it led to suspicion. So the Christians in Thessalonica were eventually accused of defying Caesar, the Roman emperor, when they said that there is another king, Jesus. And this led to a persecution that got so intense, Paul and Silas actually had to flee from the city. And this was painful for them because they loved the people there so much. And so this letter is Paul's attempt to reconnect with the Christians in Thessalonica after he got a report from Timothy that they were doing more than okay. They were flourishing despite this intense persecution. He designed the letter to have two main movements. First is a celebration of their faithfulness to Jesus, and then he challenges them to keep growing as followers of Jesus. And then these two movements are surrounded by three prayers. The letter opens with a thanksgiving prayer. The two movements are linked together by transitional prayer, and then the whole thing is concluded with a final prayer. It's a beautiful design. Paul opens by giving thanks and celebrating the Thessalonians' faith, their love for others, and their hope in Jesus despite persecution. He goes on to retell the story of their conversion, how they used to be idolatrous polytheists, and they were living in a culture where all of life was permeated by institutions and practices that honored the Greek and Roman gods. And Paul talks about how they turned away from those idols to serve the living and true God, and that they're now waiting for the coming of God's Son from heaven. So in a city like Thessalonica, transferring your allegiance to the Creator God of Israel, to King Jesus, this came at a cost. Isolation from your neighbors, hostility from your family. But for the Thessalonians, the overwhelming love of Jesus who died for them and the hope of his return, it made it all worth it. Paul then retells the story of his mission in Thessalonica and of the dear friendships he formed with the people. He uses really intimate metaphors here. They treated him like their child, and he became like their mother and like their father. He says, we were happy to share with you not only the good news from God, but our very selves, because we came to dearly love you. Paul reminds us here that the essence of Christian leadership is not about power and having influence. It's about healthy relationships and humble, loving service. He reminds them that he never asked for money. He simply came to love and serve them in the name of Jesus. And so Paul moves on to reflect on their common persecution. Just like Jesus was rejected and killed by his own people, so now Paul is persecuted by his fellow Jews, and the Thessalonians are facing hostility from their Greek neighbors. And Paul draws a strange comfort from knowing that together their sufferings are a way of participating in the story of Jesus' own life and death. Paul then shares about the anguish he experienced when he heard of the hardships the Thessalonians had after he and Silas fled. So he sent Timothy to support them and see how they were doing. And to his joy, Timothy discovered that they were going strong. They were faithful to Jesus. They were full of love for God and their neighbors. And they longed to see Paul as much as he longed to see them. And so Paul concludes with a prayer for endurance. And what's cool is that he introduces here the topics he's going to address in the letter's second half. He prays that God will grow their capacity to love, that he'll strengthen their commitment to holiness as they fix their hope on the return of King Jesus. So he opens the letter's second movement by challenging them to a life that's consistent with the teachings of Jesus. So this means, first of all, a serious commitment to holiness and sexual purity. In contrast to the promiscuous, sexually destructive culture around them, they are to follow Jesus' teaching about experiencing the beauty and the power of sex within the haven of a committed marriage covenant relationship. God takes sexual misbehavior seriously, Paul says. It dishonors and destroys people and their dignity. Following Jesus also means a commitment to loving and serving others. So Paul instructs them that Christians should be known in the city as reliable people who work really hard, not just to make money, but so that they can have resources to provide for themselves and to generously share with people who are in need. After this, Paul addresses a number of questions that Thessalonians had raised about the future hope of Jesus' return. So some Christians in the church had recently died, most likely killed as martyrs, and their friends and family are wondering about their fate when Jesus returns. And so Paul makes it clear that despite their grief and loss, not even death can separate Christians from the love of Jesus. When he returns as king, he will call both the living and the dead to himself. And Paul uses a really cool image here. He uses language that would normally describe how a city subject to the Roman Caesar would send out a delegation to welcome or meet his arrival. Paul then applies this imagery to the arrival of King Jesus. He too will be greeted by a delegation of his people who will go to meet the Lord in the air as they welcome and escort him back to this world where he'll establish his kingdom of justice and peace. Paul then wants the Thessalonians to see how this hope should motivate faithfulness to Jesus. So he pokes fun at the famous Roman propaganda that it's Caesar who brings peace and security. Of course, Rome's peace came through violence, through enslaving their enemies, and military occupation. And Paul warns that Jesus will return as king one day and confront this kind of injustice. Followers of King Jesus should live in the present as if that future day is already here. Despite the nighttime of human evil around them, they should stay sober and awake as the light of God's kingdom dawns here on earth as it is in heaven. Paul closes all of these exhortations like he began, with a hopeful prayer, that God would permeate their lives with his holiness, that he would set them apart to be completely devoted and blameless until the return of King Jesus. 1 Thessalonians reminds us that from the very beginning, following Jesus as king has produced a truly countercultural or holy way of life. And this will sometimes generate suspicion and conflict among our neighbors. But the response of Jesus' followers to such hostility should always be love, meeting opposition with grace and generosity. And this way of life is motivated by hope in the coming kingdom of Jesus that has already begun in his resurrection from the dead. And so holiness, love, and future hope, that's what 1 Thessalonians is all about.
All right. So, big fan of the Bible Project. They do a really great job of summarizing, and that's basically 1 Thessalonians. But we'll spend a little more time unpacking it, especially looking at what Ehrman has to say, as well as a few other New Testament scholars. Here are some images, just to give you some visual cues for what Thessalonica or modern day Thessaloniki is how it's referred to now, is how it looks, right? Like there's plenty of things here that were around probably in Paul's time that are still surviving. This is pretty common in the Roman world, but there you are. This is lots of the stuff that you see in modern day Thessalonica. One of the things that I'm going to do while we're going through these books of the Bible, as you see there, the founding of the Church of Thessalonica, and then in parentheses, Ehrman. I'm going to try to distinguish whenever I'm giving you something from a particular scholar. I'm going to try to indicate to you who this is coming from so that you can kind of see who's saying what, right? And so this is directly from Ehrman's slides on 1 Thessalonians. And you can see here there's a lot that we would agree with, right? It's talking about Paul's MO, that he normally goes to large cities, which makes sense. Paul's trying to have evangelistic impact, so going to big cities makes sense. Big cities are also things that you can probably get to fairly easily. They're not going to be difficult to travel to. According to his letter or his letters, his tactics usually meant that he would set up some kind of business, and that's how he would establish contact with people. He also reasons with people in the synagogue, and there is a little bit of debate back and forth about which way is his primary methodology. It seems like Luke tends to favor the idea in Acts that Paul is primarily reasoning in the synagogues, but it seems like Paul's letters tend towards Paul having a business of some sort and reaching people through that means. Now, that doesn't mean that they're contradictory to one another, though Ehrman will try to kind of push on that to make it sound like there's a contradiction there. So, one of the ways that he does that is he points out, and this is one of the things that he points out specifically in Thessalonians, is that Paul seems to say that the converts there are pagans, that he's convincing them to leave their idols and follow the one true God. So if he's reasoning with people in Thessalonica that are in the synagogue, why does he say that he converts pagans? Well, this amounts sort of to an argument from absence, right? Because he doesn't say literally everyone that I've ever converted in Thessalonica is a pagan. He just refers to pagans in Thessalonica who have been converted. So it's not, the best argument in the world to say that there are no Jews that he has converted by talking in the synagogues, right? Majority of Paul's converts don't seem to be wealthy, though likely there are at least some. This is where you start to get like house church situations where you at least find someone who has kind of the means to host a gathering. And then, as the Bible Project mentioned, they sort of understood themselves as a closed group. and they kind of close ranks in persecution and try to encourage one another to sort of stay the course, right? And so, like I said, I mean, with this, a lot of this, even though it's from Airman, we would agree with this, right? This isn't, particularly out of left field. And I have my copy of Airman's New Testament introduction with me, and I'll try to bring that each week. So if there's anything in particular that you want to see, if you can make it, then I'll be happy to let you see what Airman has to say on stuff like that. Some more images for us here on Thessalonica. This is sort of like a downtown. You see on the top left here, that's kind of a reconstruction of what you would see in a particular city like Thessalonica. And you're going to have sort of the market on the ground floor, and you're going to have residences above that. And these other two images are images of actual ruins of those specific things, right? The one on the bottom left is actually in Thessalonica. The one on the right, I forget what city it's in, but it's not in Thessalonica. So the idea, though, is that this is likely what Paul is doing when he talks about being a tent maker, and the word there just means that he's a leather worker. We tend to just sort of assume that it means tent maker, but it could mean any sort of thing related to leather working, right? Because, I mean, how many tents do people really need, right? And so if he has some kind of like leather goods business, and in this instance, Airman, I'm just stealing his quote here. He's talking about Corinth with Priscilla and Aquila. But in Thessalonica, he seems to have sort of the same thing, at least in the short term. And so it seems like he would do this sort of thing where he would set up shop, and then above the shop, he'd live there, right? And this kind of makes some sense of Paul's emphasis in Thessalonians on, saying that that he didn't rely on them for money or for support, that he worked for his own wages, that sort of thing. And this actually helps, contextually with the Greco-Roman world. Most religions in the Greco-Roman world weren't proselytizing, meaning they weren't trying to win converts, because most of them were polytheistic, so you could just add whatever god you wanted. It didn't really matter. The people who were proselytizing were philosophers, Cynics and Epicureans and Stoics and stuff like that. They're the ones who were going out trying to persuade people to agree with them. And so if you were proselytizing, you probably sounded more like a philosopher than you did like a preacher. And the philosophers had this really bad habit, specifically the Stoics, had this really bad habit of trying to hound people for money. And so it seems like Paul, recognizing that if he is trying to persuade people, he's going to sound like a philosopher, because they're the only ones trying to persuade, that he's aware of that, and so sort of self-consciously decides, we're going to make sure that no one is in a position to give us money except for the people that are exchanging it for goods, right? That he's trying to sort of like preempt that kind of critique on his preaching. Again, we don't have like super direct evidence of that, but it seems to be a reasonable conclusion. So, church at Thessalonica, again, we have Airman's take here, the church after Paul's departure. 1 Thessalonians is a friendship letter. Like I said, it's probably one of his earliest, and there's no conflict in this letter. It's not that, unlike Galatians or 1 Corinthians, Paul isn't receiving news that the church has fallen or that the church is encountering some like false teaching or something like that. In fact, like he's really happy with them, which is sort of distinct from a lot of his other letters. He just wants to make sure that they're okay, right? This is what we saw in the Bible Project video, right? They've accepted his apocalyptic message, and they're concerned about what that means in the practical world, right? Like these people that have died, what happens to them? And this actually gets played out in weird ways in the early church. Tertullian in Carthage in the 2nd and 3rd century advocates celibacy. And this is one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic Church picks up with a really hard charge on celibacy, is because Tertullian was an advocate of it. He's very influential in the West. But he emphasizes celibacy, and one of the reasons why is Tertullian says, now this guy's brilliant, but still, like, he says some wacky things. He says that if you get pregnant and Jesus comes back, you'll be pregnant for eternity. And it's just like, just wacky, you know? But it's this kind of stuff that people are like, okay, I'm with you. Jesus is coming back. What does that mean in the real world? Like, you know, if I'm paralyzed when he comes back, am I still paralyzed? Right? Like, how does this work? You know, and again, you know, a couple hundred years later, we have Tertullian saying, don't get pregnant because you might be stuck that way. Right? This is kind of like the theological version of your mom saying not to make that face because your face will freeze, right? So it's that same kind of idea. So Paul addresses this, right, in First Thessalonians, addresses this issue. And so basically is like, hey, you know, Jesus is coming back. Things are going to work out. It's going to be okay, right? This is Wright and Bird, much the same as what we just saw with Airman, right? There's large agreement here. Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians to praise the church for their perseverance, encourage them in holiness. It's likely his earliest letter without controversy. Weeks or months later, he receives news that the situation in Thessalonica deteriorates, and he writes 2 Thessalonians to provide further encouragement to perseverance. Now, this is where Ehrman's going to disagree. Ehrman's not going to agree that he writes 2 Thessalonians. Wright and Bird believe that he does. Ehrman does not. And so 2 Thessalonians is one of those disputed letters, like I said. So we'll get to that in just a second to see why is it disputed and what do we do with that, right? But 1 and 2 Thessalonians, whether 2 Thessalonians is legitimately Pauline or not, both of them are dealing with this, what's referred to as eschatology, which is the doctrine of the last things, right? So what's happening at the end? That's what they're both sort of dealing with, right? So Jesus is coming back, right? This is an outline of 1 Thessalonians. Christ will return soon. So we have this typical greetings and gospel thanksgiving, which we see in most of Paul's letters at the outset. We have a recollection of his ministry in Thessalonica, his desire to return to them, Timothy's positive report. We have the call to purity and holiness, clarifying the Lord's return, and an exhortation and final greetings and benediction. It's a very upbeat letter, very happy letter, right? Good stuff. So Christ will return soon, kind of our theme here. Well, background 1 Thessalonians, as was mentioned in the Bible Project video, we have this Acts 17 and 18 thing going on. And this is where, again, like I mentioned earlier, Ehrman has some contention with this. Ehrman specifically notes 1 Thessalonians 1:9, referring to the idolatry of the converts, and suggests that Paul didn't convert anybody that was Jewish, right? So he sees a sharp distinction between Acts and Thessalonians, such that he thinks that Luke just gets it wrong. Thinks that Luke just doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Highlights in Thessalonians. This is Blomberg. Blomberg's a evangelical New Testament scholar. Just to give you another perspective. Some highlights, we have missionary effect of the Thessalonians' conversion, compare and contrast to popular philosophy and the theme of imitation, motives for ministry and parental affection, sustained praise, will of God as consistent in Scripture is holiness and moral living, specifically with regard to sexuality, and then the twofold reason for work, specifically with regard to godliness. Blumberg continues with highlights here. The keys to counseling after Christians die is not denying grief, but we don't grieve as those without hope, right? That our grief is not of the same kind. Plus, there's something to do with a rapture. Now, this is like heavily debated theologically, the second coming of Christ, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and all that kind of stuff. The word rapture here, particularly, is hotly debated. It doesn't actually show up in the text. It shows up in the Latin translation of 1 Thessalonians 4. I forget which verse, but it's 17 or 18. But the Latin translation there is like raptura or something like that, which is where we get rapture. And you saw this in the video with the Bible Project. They talk about how Paul parallels the Greco-Roman notion of receiving your king into the town with receiving Jesus, right? And so if that's what's happening, and I think they're right, if that's what's happening, then anyone that meets Jesus in the air isn't going away with Jesus in the air. They're meeting Jesus in the air to receive him back to the earth. In the same way that people that go out of the city to receive the king come back into the city with the king, right? They don't go out of the city and then leave with the king. They go out to receive him and then come back with him. And so this notion of like the left behind kind of thing, some people believe, some people joke about, right? That's probably not what Paul has in mind here, but it's definitely hotly debated there. The parousia, our next point there, that is the theological term for the coming of Christ, and literally just means presence. And so we have development here of this tension in New Testament studies that we've talked about a couple of times already, which is the already but not yet. That Jesus has inaugurated the kingdom of God, and yet the kingdom of God is not yet fully here. And so Jesus is with us. We have the presence of the Lord, the parousia of the Lord, but it is not, his presence is not yet fully here in the sense that everything has been sorted out. So another highlight for Blomberg is reject every kind of evil, and then the holy kiss. Holy kiss is a perfect example of why we need to have an understanding of the cultural background, right? Lest we go around kissing everybody that we greet, right? So, so conclusion for 1 Thessalonians from Airman. Paul's self-proclaimed title, Apostles to the Gentiles, is apt, because from Airman's perspective, that is all that Paul is reaching. It's just Gentiles. He's convinced, Paul has convinced Gentiles at Thessalonica to turn away from their pagan gods. Members of the church form a social group with unusually strong bonds of cohesion. So that's sort of our summary of 1 Thessalonians. We have this funny cartoon here from Blomberg. Blomberg has this in his PowerPoints. And what you have there for all of those doors are all of the different perspectives on eschatology. When is Jesus coming back? That kind of stuff. Hey, we picked Matt back up. Hey, Matt, sorry. I went ahead and started moving anyway, but you only missed one slide, so and it's in the recording. So, but yeah, so Blomberg has this cartoon for us. It's basically like, here are all the different perspectives on when Jesus is coming back, all that kind of stuff. And when you go through the door, you realize everybody's going to the same place. It doesn't really matter which perspective you have. We're all going to the same place. So, and all these different perspectives are like, pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, amillennial, premillennial, post-millennial, all that kind of stuff. And I heard a seminary professor one time say that he's pan-trib. He thinks it's all going to pan out in the end. So I like that perspective. That's good stuff. So, Thessalonians and Christ's return. What we have in 1 Thessalonians is the concern that Christ's return is delayed. And so Paul writes 1 Thessalonians and says, he's still coming soon, right? Like, it's okay. He is still coming. And then we have a concern that Christ had already come in some spiritual way in response to 1 Thessalonians. And so 2 Thessalonians responds, okay, yeah, but he's not coming that soon, right? Like, he's coming soon, but not that soon. And this is one of the reasons why people debate whether or not 2 Thessalonians is Paul, because 1 Thessalonians seems to be saying, like, man, he could be here any minute. And 2 Thessalonians seems to be saying, like, no, he can't. Right? Like, there are things that need to happen in order for him to come. And so there's a little bit of a conflict here. But if you look at this perspective, like, it seems to make sense that Paul could write both, because they're both responding to different things, right? If you think, you know, I don't know if Jesus is even coming back anymore, you can see how someone would say, yes, he is. And you can see how that group of people could respond, okay, well, maybe we missed it. No, you didn't miss it. Like, it's not one of those things that you can miss, right? And so this is, you know, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians kind of make sense together depending on how you approach them, right? So authorship, from Ehrman's perspective, this is this image here is first page of Ephesians in one of the oldest copies of the New Testament we have. And you can see there that somebody has written something in the margin, right? And so that kind of stuff happens, right? We talked about that when we talked about textual criticism towards the beginning of the semester. And so that kind of stuff starts to kind of mess with our notion of authorship. And Ehrman is really fond of, like, pushing on that kind of stuff. From his perspective, many ancient authors wrote books in the name of notable figures. And this is called pseudepigraphy or pseudonymity, either false writings or false name. And so he asks the question, is it possible that the New Testament includes forged books? And then answers that by saying, many scholars believe that as many as 6 of the letters ascribed to Paul were not actually written by Paul. Now, one of the problems with this is pseudonymity, pseudepigraphy both exist in the ancient world. People do write under other people's names. And we know this because we have ancient writers talking about it. Why would ancient writers talk about it if no one did it? Doesn't make any sense, right? So some people did it, but the ancient writers talking about it all universally condemn the practice. It's not like it's something that people thought was like a perfectly acceptable thing to do, right? So it's problematic to think that you have a Christian community who are, you know, emphasizing these ethical teachings and transgressing ethics in the midst of it, right? That's just a kind of an odd perspective. And so again, to continue with Ehrman, are there pseudonymous books in the New Testament? Consensus among critical scholars is a resounding yes. That is not accurate. He's excluding critical scholars who are evangelicals. He's basically, his definition of critical scholars is people like him. And so that's kind of not fair. We know that forgery was relatively widespread in the world because the ancients themselves said so. Someone who wrote in the name of a famous person was not necessarily driven by wicked intent. I don't know why iTunes decided to just jump up there. That's kind of weird. Just move that out of the way, and we'll keep on trucking. There we go. So from Aaron's perspective, well, maybe they have the right intentions. You know, the ends justify the means kind of thing. Such imitation was actually an art, and this is actually true. We have like rhetorical handbooks that show how people were trying, how people would learn how to mimic a person's specific style in particular classes on rhetoric. But because, regardless of that, like that was like practice. That wasn't something that you did and then tried to, like, you know, pass it off like actually as that person, right? And so Ehrman, you know, this image on our right here, this is a woman presiding over a ritual meal. This is in catacombs. And Ehrman notes that the author of the pastorals, no doubt, would have disapproved of a woman officiating at the meal. And that's, from his perspective, he's assuming that that's not Paul, and that whoever that wasn't Paul is against women doing this kind of thing. There's just a lot of really big assumptions there. There's a lot of reasons to disagree with him on this. But to continue from his perspective, some people suggest that Paul wrote through a secretary, and we do have evidence towards the end of Romans that there's Paul offers greetings, and then forget the guy's name, but it says, and I, Paul's secretary or some such, also greet you or something like that. Well, there's no evidence that any secretary would write something in someone else's name. That wouldn't be a secretary, that would be a forger. Secretaries were supposed to write down essentially verbatim what you were dictating to them. Ehrman also responds to the fact that it does sound like Paul in some places, and his response is, yeah, but mimicry isn't really all that hard. And then there's an ancient practice of students signing their teachers' names, because anything that the students, had to say was simply an extension of what they had learned at the feet of their master. I've got a nice little typo there, AHD instead of that. Unfortunately, though, there's no evidence of this practice during the time of the New Testament, and it's only in philosophical schools. It's not in any other group. And so Ehrman responds to all of those and basically says none of that stuff works. And so the reasons that he gives for it not being Paul are eschatology. Eschatology, again, being the doctrine of the last things, talked about a minute ago. And so you have the end is coming soon, but not until. And that seems contradictory to stay alert so that you aren't caught off guard by Jesus. Right? That seems to be kind of like contradictory for Ehrman. Prior teaching, 2 Thessalonians 2:5, why were they surprised by the death of church members if they'd already been instructed of the delay of Christ's return? Some questions about the Antichrist. 2 Thessalonians put a lot of emphasis on him, but there's really not any other place in Paul where he's a central character. In 2 Thessalonians 3:17, it says, basically, this is the way that I write, but that way is not followed in anything else that Paul writes. And then some have even claimed that the warning of a false letter in 2 Thessalonians 2:2 is actually referring to 1 Thessalonians. That the author of 2 Thessalonians is aware of 1 Thessalonians and saying basically you shouldn't read that garbage because it's fake, fake news. So that's Ehrman's perspective. Blomberg's perspective, some claim there's a shift in imminent expectations, same kind of thing, right? Some argue that 2 Thessalonians, its mimicry of 1 Thessalonians, seems to be like, if you've ever proofread a paper and saw that, like, someone's trying to use words that aren't actually words they would normally use, you can kind of pick up on, like, that isn't quite right. That's not quite how you would say that. 2 Thessalonians is more authoritarian than the pastorally warm 1 Thessalonians. And the warnings of a letter supposedly from us and the Pauline autograph are thought to be signals of a pseudonymous author. And so these are, similar to what Ehrman just gave us for reasons why Paul didn't write it. In defense of Pauline authorship, Blomberg says that signs are not incompatible with imminent expectation, meaning that Paul can tell us, here are things that we will see before Jesus comes. That is not incompatible with Jesus could come at any minute, because we could miss the signs. And in fact, when you look at prophecy in Scripture, typically people do not understand prophecy in Scripture until after it has been fulfilled. So even if we are given signs, likely we are not going to understand those signs until after they have happened. You think about Jesus coming, right? Like there are things in the Old Testament that point to Jesus arriving in the New Testament. And yet no one in the New Testament really got it until after, right? And then they look back on it and they're like, oh, this kind of makes sense, right? It's hardly surprising that letters written close together would have similar literary features. Differences in tone is overstated, but even granting the point, Corinthian correspondence shows how quickly Paul can alter his tone, even with things in a single letter. And any argument based on tone is assuming that we know way more about what someone would say than we probably are capable of knowing. It's really difficult to be able to say, this is something Paul would say, or this is something Paul would not say, right? That's really tough. 2 Thessalonians does not warn about a spurious letter, but rather any teaching allegedly from us. And the line about Paul's signature being in all the other letters would be an odd invention from a forger, since many Pauline letters make no reference to a signature. And so if you're going to forge and you're going to add that in there, you are really bad at it, right? Like you are not doing a good job of copying your source material. So those are some arguments back and forth regarding 2 Thessalonians and the authorship of it. Wright and Bird, as I mentioned before, believe that Paul wrote it. I'm not persuaded by Ehrman's perspective. Wright and Bird have a couple of pages in their book explaining why they believe that Paul did write it. But yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to some of the other letters that are disputed. Yeah, so let's take a look at Bible Project again for 2 Thessalonians. Hopefully this one will work as well.
Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians. So not long after Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, he got a report about the Christians in Thessalonica, that the problems he had addressed in that letter not only had continued, but had gotten worse. The persecutions had intensified, and the Thessalonian Christians had become confused and scared about the return of Jesus. So Paul sent off this short letter, which is designed to have 3 sections that address the 3 problems in this church. Paul first offers hope in the midst of their continued persecution. And then he offers clarity about the coming day of the Lord. And then finally, he brings a really specific challenge to the idle, people who were refusing to work jobs. And the end of each of these sections is clearly marked by a short closing prayer. Paul opens with a thanksgiving prayer for the Thessalonians' continued faithfulness and love, and specifically for their endurance. He's learned that their Greek and Roman and perhaps even Jewish neighbors have intensified their persecution of these Christians. They're a religious minority facing violent oppression. And Paul's worried that they might give up on Jesus if it gets worse. So Paul reminds them, like he did in the first letter, that their suffering because of being associated with Jesus, it's a way of participating in God's kingdom. Jesus was inaugurated as king by his suffering on the cross. And so his followers will show their victory over the world by imitating Jesus' nonviolence and patient endurance. Paul also reminds them that this won't last forever. When Jesus returns, he will bring his justice to bear on those that have oppressed them and shed the blood of the innocent. Specifically, he says that their punishment is to be banished away from the face of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Paul does not speculate here on the fate of those who reject Jesus, except to say that throughout their lives they wanted nothing to do with Jesus, and in the end, they get what they want: relational distance from their Creator and their King. And for Paul, this is the ultimate tragedy. To choose separation from Jesus, who is the source of all life and love, is to embrace one's own undoing. He closes this thought by praying that God would use their suffering to bring about deep character change inside of them, so that their lives would bring honor to the name of Jesus. Paul then moves on to address a specific issue related to the return of Jesus and the day of the Lord. So somebody in the Thessalonian church community had been spreading wrong information in Paul's name, saying that God's final act of justice on human evil, the day of the Lord, it was upon them, it has come. And these people had likely been predicting dates about the end of all things, and they were frightening other Christians. And you can see why. Due to the intense persecution, they were vulnerable to somebody claiming that Jesus had already returned like a thief in the night. They'd been left behind. Maybe he abandoned the Thessalonians to their suffering. This kind of talk really ticks Paul off. It's misrepresenting his teaching. The return of Jesus should never inspire fear, but rather hope and confidence. Paul reminds them of everything he taught them about Jesus' return back when he was in town. And he gives a short summary here. It's actually too short. This paragraph has lots of puzzles and problems of interpretation. But what's clear is that he cites the well-known theme from the prophets Isaiah and Daniel, that the kingdoms of this world will continue to produce rulers who rebel against God, like Nebuchadnezzar or the king of the north did in the past. These leaders had exalted themselves to divine authority, And for Paul, these ancient kings and prophecies, they give us images. They set out a pattern that he saw fulfilled in his own day in the Roman emperors, Caligula and Nero, and he expected that it would be repeated again. That history would culminate with such a rebellious ruler, empowered by evil itself, someone who will wreak havoc and violence in God's world, but not forever. When Jesus returns, he will confront the rebel and all who perpetrate evil, and he will deliver his people. So Paul's point here is not to give later readers fuel for apocalyptic speculation. Rather, he's comforting the Thessalonians. He's recalling the teachings of Jesus from Mark chapter 13, who said that the events leading up to his return would be very public and obvious. And so they don't need to be scared or worried that they've been left behind. Rather, they need to stay faithful until Jesus returns to deliver them. And so in his closing prayer, he asked Jesus and the Father to comfort and strengthen the Thessalonians to stay faithful to the way of Jesus. Which brings Paul to the final topic. It's a challenge for those who were idle, which doesn't just mean lazy. This refers to people who were irresponsible and who refused to work and provide for themselves, resulting in chaotic personal lives. So Paul had actually addressed this problem in his first letter, and it seems like it's gotten worse. Now, we don't know for certain why some people in this church were refusing to work. It's possible that this problem is connected to the previous one. Maybe some people thought Jesus would return very soon, and so they quit their jobs and dropped out of normal life. But it's more likely that Paul's addressing a problem related to a practice in Roman culture called patronage. So you'd have poor people living in cities, and they would become clients, kind of like personal assistants to wealthy people. And they would live off of their occasional generosity, but there were lots of strings attached. This sometimes involved the clients and their patrons' morally corrupt way of life, not to mention it was unpredictable income. So this is what Paul seems to refer to when he says these people lead a disordered life. They're not working and they're meddling in the business of others. So Paul reminds them of the example he gave when he was with them. He didn't ask for their money. He worked a manual labor job so he could provide for himself and so he could serve the Thessalonians free of charge. He says this is the ideal. A follower of Jesus should imitate Jesus' self-giving love by working hard so they can provide for themselves and so their lives can be a benefit to other people. He concludes this with a final prayer, that in the midst of all their confusion and suffering, that God would grant them peace through the Lord Jesus the Messiah. This short letter to the Thessalonians, it helps us see that the early Christian belief in Jesus' return and the hope of final judgment, these ideas were not meant for generating speculation about apocalyptic timelines. Rather, these beliefs brought hope. They inspired faithfulness and devotion to Jesus, especially for persecuted Christians facing violent opposition. And so for later generations of Christians, whether they undergo persecution or not, this letter reminds us that what you hope for shapes what you live for. And that's what 2 Thessalonians is all about.
Awesome. I love those guys. They do such great work. So Blumberg, if you remember, gave us the summary of 1 Thessalonians saying that Jesus is coming back soon. And so Blumberg's summary of 2 Thessalonians is, but not that soon, right? This is how Blumberg balances 1 and 2 Thessalonians, that Jesus is coming back, but not that quickly, right? Like, let's try to balance between the two of these things. Right? And I think that makes some sense. Background for 2 Thessalonians, if it's Pauline and after 1 Thessalonians, which makes sense, right? It's probably pretty short after 1 Thessalonians. There's increased persecution. There's a problem with people that are idle, all things that we just saw in the Bible Project video. Irrespective of authorship and order, it seems like it's probably also from Corinth. There are disruptions described in 2:2, commonly seen as due to a forged letter, but it could just be a misinterpretation of the first letter that people are circulating incorrect teaching based on the first letter, and that Paul's trying to say, don't do that, right? For the outline of 2 Thessalonians, we have a greeting, just like we did before. In spite of the fact that this is a little bit more corrective, it's still a pretty happy letter. Coming judgment and future glory, the turmoil and travail of the lawless one, exhortation to steadfastness, prayer requests, warning against idleness, and then final greetings and benediction. The exegetical highlights, and exegetical just means interpretive, right? To draw the meaning out of. And so interpretive highlights in 2 Thessalonians. There is judgment is a pretty important thing in 2 Thessalonians, the nature of hell, annihilationism, God's love comforting the oppressed. There's the identity of the man of lawlessness and the restrainer. These are kind of confusing things. 2 Thessalonians can be kind of tough to understand when it comes to that sort of thing. Problems with the rebuilt temple, God and Satan's influence on unbelievers after their rebellion. But again, it's meant to encourage, right? So eschatology is not meant to discourage. It's not meant to leave believers hopeless, but it's intended to focus believers on the location of their hope, which is, as the author of Hebrews says, that Jesus is the anchor of our hope on the other side, right? He is in the heavenly temple on the other side of the veil and the anchor of our hope. Then we have sociological reconstruction to supplement a theological one with rehabilitative ends. And so that is 2 Thessalonians. So that gets us through 1st and 2nd. So we're trying to stay on track, sort of. Do we have any questions on either of these or anything else thus far in the course?
I have a question.
Doing okay?
I have a question. Ryan? Hey, Ryan.
Just pronunciation. Yeah, and so modern Greek, the pronunciation of several different vowels has shifted over the past 2,000 years. And so our best guess at how things were pronounced around Paul's time would be that it would be Thessalonica, but it has shifted to Thessaloniki at this point. And so, but there are wars fought over Greek pronunciation. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm in a forum on Facebook called Nerdy Language Majors, and there's like 6,000 people in this group, and it's people that have PhDs in ancient languages, people that know Ugaritic and Akkadian and all this kind of stuff. And man, if you post something in there about how should I pronounce Greek, like it will turn into like a 100 comment war. Usually, actually, before that'll even happen, the admins will just say, just search the forum or deleting your post. Because it's been fought so many times that, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. People get really amped about it. And it's kind of weird. I presented a paper at a scholarly meeting 3 years ago, and I pronounced a few Greek words in the midst of it wasn't even a New Testament paper. It was a historical theology paper, but there was some stuff in there that had to do with some Greek words, and I pronounced them, and I was confronted afterwards by somebody because I did not pronounce the words the way that they thought they should be pronounced. Yeah, people get heated about it. It's kind of weird. It's kind of a weird thing to get heated about. So, John, I see your hand.
Yes, sorry. About the exegetical, which I did not know that term before.
Are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I'm not getting any sound from you.
Oh. Now?
I see your mic bouncing, but I can't hear anything that you're saying.
Okay.
Let me try something real quick.
You hear me?
Yes, I can hear Matt.
Well, I can hear you too, John, but I don't think Ryan can hear either of us.
Okay.
You might want to put your question in the chat.
Yeah.
See if I can change my audio output here. Okay. Yeah. All right, let's try that again. Go for it, John.
All right, I put it in chat. Can you see that?
Oh, I didn't look at that, but I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, whatever. I'll read it then. So, going to the exegetical, okay? So when Paul, for this example, when he interprets something like when Jesus returns from the dead will rise first, if what is his source? What's his authority? When it comes to interpretation, when there doesn't seem to be a source from gospel or scripture, what do scholars think in terms of, in general, and in particular on this one? What's Paul's authority for his interpretations?
That's a great question. I'll have to dig into it for this specific passage, but in general, man, like first century exegesis is like it's pretty fascinating, the approach to the approach that they take to the text. It's trying to think the easiest way to explain it here. So like the quintessential New Testament use of the Old Testament passage is Matthew 2:15 quoting Hosea 11:1. Matthew 2:15 quotes Hosea 11:1 saying, "Out of Egypt I've called my son."
Uh-huh.
And Matthew says this is talking about Jesus. But if you read Hosea, it's talking about the Exodus. So Matthew feels perfectly comfortable taking an Old Testament reference to an Old Testament event and applying it forward to something in Jesus's life.
Uh-huh.
He's perfectly comfortable with that. And it seems like the rest of the New Testament authors are fairly comfortable doing the same thing. That it's sort of like they don't mind being creative as long as they're not contradicting something. Mm-hmm. And so you see this in rabbinic interpretation, right? They'll get creative with stuff as long as they're not violating an existing law and existing concept. They really don't mind just, tossing something weird out there. Paul, even in Ephesians chapter 5 or 6, I think, he actually changes a psalm when he quotes it, because he quotes Psalm 68, I think. When he quotes Psalm 68 in the original context, Psalm 68 is saying you received gifts from men. The whole quotation is like you took captivity captive and you received gifts from men. Well, when Paul quotes it, he quotes it as you took captivity captive and you gave gifts to men. And so again, he's just comfortable just making a change there. And so I think he's okay with, the easy answer here would be that, he's inspired by the Spirit, right?
Right.
But
well, okay, but his high status, Paul's high status, at some point you've got to say, just, Paul's, you can't just say, take my word for it, right? So as you say, inspired by the Spirit.
Yeah.
But clearly there are other times when he is interpreting scripture.
Yeah.
So I guess it is a case-by-case basis where scholars have looked at that and said, okay, in this case, this instance of him talking about the dead will rise first is what, they will, as you say, dig into where's Paul coming from on this. Is he citing scripture somewhere? Is it an interpretation that we can tie back to something? Or do we just step back and nod our heads and say, well, we'll take your word for that?
Yeah.
Or do you have, is it a case by case basis? Every time he makes an interpretation, we have to take a look at where he's coming from.
Yeah, it's sort of case by case, because there are times where it's going to be evident that, what he's working off of here is, this Second Temple writing that, whatever. Actually, probably a better example for this is in I think 1 Corinthians, he refers to the Jews wandering in the desert, drinking from a rock, and he says that the rock was Christ. And the wording that he uses there, he's talking about this rock sort of going with them through the wilderness. Well, if you look at the text in Exodus, I believe, could be Numbers though, it's just, there's nothing that indicates that the rock moves with them. But there's a Second Temple interpretation of that by Jewish rabbis that they say that since Moses has struck the rock, that since the same thing happens each time that he strikes the rock, that it's the same rock and that the rock moved with them. And so Paul is just authorizing this Second Temple Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament and just adding it into his letter. And so there are times where we have that, you know, where we have something that we're like, okay, here's where he gets that. Here's where he's being influenced to make that decision. But there are other times where we just kind of scratch our head and say, I don't really know what he's doing here. And you know, off the top of my head with this one, with the dead shall rise first, I'm not sure, but I'll take a look at it. There may be something, you know, apocryphal or in the pseudepigrapha or, you know, some other thing.
I also have a question that's somewhat similar. So you mentioned a little bit about some of these authorship dispute, and I might have missed that if you have elaborated on this, but I think one of the arguments that is like sort of for that Paul or whoever actually wrote the letters is that it's looked down upon, right? I think that's what you said. So then it would be weird for people to accept it at its face value if it wasn't true. But like, aren't there other letters that are also like, I'm just trying to think, like, how did they decide which ones are real and which ones aren't, you know, because I think there are others that were not accepted as authentic. Or more not accepted.
There are other letters that are disputed that are accepted in the New Testament, and then there are other letters that are disputed that are not accepted in the New Testament. And that is an issue of canonicity, which is a larger conversation. But the short form for that is the canon is largely decided in the early church on the basis of agreed upon authorship, the date at which it was written, so that it, you know, if it's written in 150, it couldn't have been written by Paul, so that just sets it right out. So the date when it was written, agreed upon authorship needs to be an apostle or a close association of an apostle. And then theological content. If it's theologically contradictory, then it's not accepted. Contradictory with other accepted writings and with the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And so those are sort of like the standards of canonicity. But you know, within Paul's writings, I mean, there's a lot of people in early church history that thought Paul wrote Hebrews. You know, and then there's a lot of people that say he didn't. You know, I was reading somebody from the 4th century the other day, and he says, you know, just as Paul said, and then quotes Hebrews. You know, and so like as late as the 4th century, you've got people that think Paul wrote Hebrews, and he almost certainly didn't. And so there are a lot of like open debates about, you know, who wrote it, when was it written, how do we know that, you know, that sort of stuff. To me, the evident or the argument for it not being Paul would have to be remarkably strong for it to succeed, because, you know, you've got all of these people in the earliest church who are circulating these letters. They're not circulating them just because, you know, just for fun. You know, First Peter tells us that there's a collection of Paul's letters that are being circulated. And so that is something you're going to have to overcome. And then any argument towards tone any argument towards vocabulary, any of that stuff. We just don't have enough of Paul to be able to say, this is his vocabulary. He would not have used this word. Or this is his tone. He would not have written this way. We just don't have enough of that to be able to say definitively, Paul didn't write that. You know, we would have to find something that's legitimately contradictory in order to really state that it's not Paul. And so I tend to just default towards the more conservative position that Paul wrote all of the letters that are attributed to him, and only change my position when I'm presented with sufficient evidence. So,
Got it. Thank you.
yeah. And I mean, canonicity is a big question that we could take a lot more time on that. There are a lot of really good books on that. If that's something that you're interested in, I can recommend some other resources for you. So,
I had one other quick comment, or ask you to comment. You mentioned in an early slide about Paul's preaching in large cities, which seems to me in stark contrast to Jesus.
Yeah.
Preaching is. I don't know if there's anything to be said about that. If it's just the fact that Christ's work on earth is done and now it's time to move and capture big numbers, or if there's something else going on there, or if that's a venue that Paul is more comfortable with, or his job now is to preach to as many people as he can. So that's more practical.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to get cut off again here in a second, but I can say I think there's debates about methodology that beyond just Jesus and Paul. In the early church, you've got other people who want to go out into the desert and focus on God, and then you have other people who want to get into the city and mix it up with everybody in the city. And so it varies from person to person on which strategy they think is the best. It usually comes down to whether or not they believe, the purpose of church is for saints or for sinners. Is it a hospital for sinners, or is it a community of saints? And if it's a community of saints, let's go out in the desert and forget everybody else. If it's a hospital for sinners, then let's get into the middle of the city and help as many people as we can. And so there seems to be some fluidity there, and I don't know that there's one right answer on that. I think there's room for monastic communities that withdraw, and I think there's room for communities that go into the roughest places and try to help out. I think there's room for both, and so I think Paul going to the cities is a good thing. Jesus dealing with the what good can come from Nazareth, that's a good thing too. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Well, I'm glad this works. I'm glad I actually got to get you guys in here. So hopefully we can continue that, and I'll see y'all next week. So.